Previously on agentpalmer.com, Dishonesty and Daggers, Mitchell's column collection is a delight. Bye Bye Barry makes me wish for more modern men like Sanders, and I can assure you, Steph will be on the show again. This is the Palmer Files, episode 116, with Bill Childs, host of the radio show Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child, who's here to discuss the importance and longevity of radio, audio, music, and so much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 116th episode is Bill Childs, practicer of law by day and host of Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child at night. For over 15 years, Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child has been providing the soundtrack to thousands of childhoods around the country. The show plays indie music for indie kids, including the best music aimed at kids, but not limited to kids' music. We met online when I discovered his show somehow, which I usually only catch as a playlist, but it's worth checking out. You're about to hear us discuss the importance and longevity of radio, music, radio influences in popular culture, They Might Be Giants, Generations, NPR, and what Bill does aside from loving music and having his own radio show. All that and more is on your way shortly. But first, remember, if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can find all contact information for Bill Childs and myself in the show notes. You can find more information about Bill and his show, Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child, at sparetherock.com. Don't forget, you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com. And of course, email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's get into it. Bill, I have been a long-time radio listener, and I'm of the generation that came of age in the Napster era of pirating stuff, but I still was very much a radio person, and I was radio club in college, and I'm currently involved in the on the board of directors for my local NPR station. I'm also a podcaster. I've been hearing for years that radio is dying, and yet radio continues to endure. I know one of the things you do, of the many hats you wear, is radio. I cannot explain why radio endures, other than, like, personally to me, like, it's always there and I can always rely on it. That's all I have. Do you have a better idea from someone who's more behind the mic on radio than I am, of being like, this is why it endures?
Yeah, so it's an interesting and really very central question to my life. I'm a little bit older than you are. I think I grew up slightly pre-Napster, and although I was think in my 20s when it kind of came into existence.
Yeah, you have I was in my teens, so we're very close. Yeah.
So what I would say, so I think there are things about radio that are unique to radio that podcasting does not take the place of. I think podcasting is sort of as close as there is to an equivalent of the core of radio. We can talk about streams and playlists and automated sort of AI kind of things separately.
There's an overlap there too of like, because I know some people in my station put their shows together ahead of time, which isn't quite podcasting, but it's also not quite live.
Yeah, well, and of course, my radio show is not live. I record it more or less. It was when we started. We can talk about what my radio show is in a little bit. But I think one of the things that is unique about radio as it exists is that it is a one-to-many format, right? And that for the most part, everybody's hearing at the same time. So it's this interesting hopefully many collective experience. And that's a thing that is not the case for podcasts, right? Because this podcast that we're recording, we're doing it now. It'll go out over the internet in days, weeks, months, and people will listen to it days, weeks, months into years from now, potentially.
And
right?
And when they do, very often it's a 1-to-1, or I guess for us it's a 2-to-1. You know, we're
Right.
outnumbering the listener because we're in their headphones or their earbuds or their whatever, and it's not to whoever happens to be on that dial.
Right. And that's a constraint on radio, the fact that you only hear people, you only get audience members if they happen to turn it on at the right time, but it's also a feature bug and a feature, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's something particularly intimate about it for people to say, oh man, I'm hearing somebody who is sitting in the studio wherever they are, and they're talking to me, or they're playing something that is for me. And I think that's different. And then on the music side, comparing it, sort of thinking about what the alternatives are in terms of the automated streams that Apple Music has or Spotify Music has or whatever, all the algorithms that put that stuff together, they can do that stuff pretty well. And there's a lot of radio that is, of course, very much programmed within an inch of its life. But there continues for me to be something special about hearing, listening to KUTX, which is our flagship station, and hearing Lori Gallardo on in the afternoon, and knowing that she maybe didn't pick all the songs because they have a playlist, but that she picked a lot of those songs, and that it is her voice. Or I live now in the Twin Cities and listening to The Current, and Mary Lucia is no longer on that station, but knowing that afternoon drive, who knew what you were going to get, but it was going to be something that was in her voice writ large, not her. I mean, it was her literal voice as well, right? But her sort of musical selection voice. And for me, that's why radio continues to be important. Why radio to me, why radio continues to be important more generally is that I think in the music space, I think talk and so on is a little bit different, and I think NPR is a pretty useful model for sort of a parallel to what I'm about to talk about in the news and information space, is that it continues to be a potentially trusted source of curation. I don't like that word because it tends to get overused, I think.
Yeah.
But it's one of the pluses of the Napster era, followed by the streaming era, and the absolute. This is, I think, it's 100% a good thing that the democratization of the distribution of music. The barriers to entry are much, much lower. But there's a downside to that to the listener, in that it's very hard to find all of the wheat among all of that chaff. And so radio can be, it's not the only, but it can be one of the sources for, it's gatekeeping, but in a positive way, I guess.
Yeah. My local NPR has an afternoon drive called The Blend, where you'll hear music. You'll discover music. If you listen to it for 4 songs, even if you happen to be the music nut and know 3 of them, there's going to be a 4th one you don't know. And I like to attribute that show to being like the record collection I recently went through, which was collecting dust in my basement, and I inherited it, and I decided I want to go through this, and I discovered Good Rats. Now, Good Rats is a band that, if you enjoy Aerosmith, if you enjoy the Rolling Stones, if you enjoy Bob Seger, if you enjoy those 3 bands, you will love Good Rats. However, it had
I like one of those 3 bands, so I might like a third of Good Rats.
That's fair.
But.
Yeah, but it astounds me that in all of the algorithms, though, I would have never gotten Good Rats had it not been for this rant. They're not big enough to kind of, I don't know, somehow break the algorithm. And so I think you need a human element. For me, it was literally inheriting these records from like a long lost cousin or something. But I think radio DJs can be that step if you're not going through an old record collection or going through old CDs. And I think there's an element where the radio DJ has replaced your, for anybody who remembers High Fidelity as a movie, your record store snob.
Yeah.
And so there's an argument to be made that we're losing that with our Blockbusters and video rental stores going away too, of the human element of being like, this is something you'll still like. Like, it doesn't fit into the algorithm of whatever it is that you like thrillers. it's kind of a thriller. It's kind of a driving rock beat. You know, you'll like it. And I think there's a part of that. I still think radio, to kind of piggyback on what you said, the one thing that I think radio and podcasting have writ large is that it is still a deeply personal medium, audio, in any form. And I think that there's something you just can't capture with the written word or with moving video images that you can do in someone's headphones.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we probably should also note that I think both of us are talking about a relatively small chunk of what is radio today, right? We're talking about, I mean, it's not all literally left of the dial anymore, but it is sort of tends to be that stuff down at that end, or stuff that's associated with stuff down at that end. So, I mean, Audacy, AUDACY, which is one of the major radio station chains, filed bankruptcy today or yesterday. They're going to come through, they're going to reorganize and so on and so forth. But a lot of the sort of traditional radio, the stuff that isn't the NPR stations or the non-commercial AAA stations or the commercial AAA stations for that matter, the stuff that isn't the more eclectic end of things is struggling and is not representing. Some of the other stuff is struggling too, but is not representing what we're talking about here. There are a lot of stations that are still playing, you know, the same very small number of songs and are aiming to make it so that if you turn it on for a minute, you're going to recognize it and you'll stay on for a second, because that's how sort of the stuff that's driven by ratings, that tends to incentivize that, which is fine, I guess. It's not what I want, but it is a form of radio.
It's very weird that I am exactly 40 and the classic rock station that I can turn on today is playing what I would have heard when I was 20.
Yeah.
And so occasionally there will be songs from the last 20 years that will make it in, but generally speaking, it's still that ZZ Top, Appetite. Yeah. For some reason, Appetite era Guns N' Roses and Nothing Beyond, old Aerosmith, old Rolling Stones. And it's just like, okay.
Yeah.
That was 20 years ago. That's,
yeah.
And now
so
it's the same.
The extent that radio is, I think, still vibrant. I mean, you know, those stations are making money, and God bless them, I guess. But to the extent that radio is still vibrant and relevant to me in the same way that radio was relevant to me. So I'm 52, so I'm a little bit more older than I thought than you. But when I was in my teenage years, it's I think a decreasing portion of the radio dial is doing that stuff.
So I will say, I don't know where I got my interest from being behind the microphone as such. I know 10-year-old me went to summer camp and woke up at a god-awful hour for being 10 or 11 to trudge to the radio hut and be a radio DJ for, I don't know what it was, 45 minutes or an hour during breakfast for That's 4 awesome. Weeks during summer camp. And then that kind of got put on hold until I played with microphones as a teenager with rock bands and stuff. And then it's not until college that I get behind the mic in a radio station. But I don't know where that all started for me. There's no inspiration. I don't know. I was interested in music, I guess. And I was willing to wake up at 6:30 in the morning at summer camp. Like the barrier's pretty low. Can you wake up this early and will you are the only two questions you need to answer. From there, it gets a little fuzzy until I get behind the mic of the podcast.
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting because for people my age, I don't think this is going to count for you, although I'm curious. One of the things that I find that a lot of people who end up doing rock radio broadly defined, because what I do is kind of broadly defined rock radio, watch WKRP in Cincinnati and were obsessed with that and loved that. And that's how a lot of it came. And I think that probably was before your time. I
mean, I know of it in syndication. Kind of in that MASH, Mary Tyler Moore block from like Nick at Night. I will say news radio is formative.
Sure. Okay, I can see that.
For maybe news radio comes along around the same time for me as WKRP comes for you, because I think news radio hits in my early teens.
Yeah, and I actually don't remember exactly when WKRP was, but I think that's probably about right. I think I was in high school.
So it's still that look. I will also say, for my generation, I remember the Howard Stern television show that was just a static camera of his radio show.
Okay.
And I remember that being like, this is at the same time that MTV is all about TRL. And yet there were kids in my class that were like, yeah, did you check out Howard?
Interesting.
Which is I know that as podcasts have kind of merged into video and people are just talking heads talking to microphones, the Howard Stern show at the time was just a static shot of people talking on microphones. It wasn't exciting.
Right.
And yet still there's
something neat about it.
Yeah, there was something about it. And so you kind of end up with this. I think for my generation, radio still had a mystique. I might be the last generation to say that. So
let me put this to you. And I haven't thought this through. I've got a couple of little facts that will lead up to something that I think is an interesting question. So I was very much what we might call politely an indoor kid. I was not a popular kid. I did mathlete. I played violin, all that sort of thing, right? Okay. So sort of take this point A. Point B, I will tell a brief story that's radio related. Okay. That I think may actually be more motivational to me than I have realized in the past. So I lived in Bartlesville, Oklahoma until I was 12. And my mom was an organizer for the Equal Rights Amendment and for sort of progressive causes more generally, and co-founded a feminist organization called the Women's Network there in Bartlesville. So you can imagine how popular a feminist organization is in Northeast Oklahoma. Yeah. But in any event, they had their meetings at the Bonanza, a little chain steak shop. Okay. And I went with her one time, and it was in the conference room or whatever, the banquet room. And the local radio station, KWN, is 1400 AM. I still remember the call signs and numbers and all that. They every week would play Casey Kasem's American Top 40. And every week they would give away the actual LPs that were sent out to radio stations for that. Because that's how Casey Kasem was distributed, because there was no internet, they didn't have satellite or anything like that. And you would enter in a drawing there to get entered. And I was bored. I was at this meeting, so I entered, 30 times, and I won it. And so I was in 5th or 6th grade at the time. And every Friday, in whichever class I was in, you could bring music in to play. And I grew up, my parents listened to mostly classical and jazz. So I didn't have any rock radio records in the house, which is what everybody really wanted to listen to, or rock or pop. And I never had anything interesting to bring in. And I was like, I've got literally the top 40 songs in the country. I'm going to bring it in. And people went nuts. They were like, oh, this is all we should play. And I wonder sort of how much of that made me be like, oh, this is how I can connect to the cool kids, is by being like the radio guy. Like I never had, it wasn't until much, much later that I thought at all about doing radio as a job. And I still don't do radio as a job, just so that's clear. I thought for a while about that when I was in college, about trying to do that as a career path. I'm glad I didn't. Yeah, that is a crazy way to make a living. But I will say this. There is a Harry Chapin song that makes me feel like I should never go into radio as a radio DJ. Yeah. I think it's WOLD for anyone listening, right? I don't know it. It's literally just him saying, it's him writing as a DJ trying to remain hip, but not being. Right. Okay. And so every time I think about a career as a DJ, not in radio, but just as a DJ, I think of that. For some reason, that song is a barrier to entry for me. It's fair. Yeah. Well, I mean, mostly it's just no matter what you do, and where you are, your station might flip at any moment. And you might lose your job, and you might either lose your job or suddenly be like, well, now you have to play like new metal or whatever. I guess nobody's going to be playing new metal now. And for me, a big part of doing radio, and one of the things I love about the show I do, is playing stuff that I like and not really having to answer to somebody else about it. If a station doesn't want to play my show, they just don't play my show, and that's fine.
I wonder what the dropout rate is, because my camp and college experience is literally what you just described. You get an hour or a half, you get however long your time is, and you play what you want to hear. Exactly. And then anybody who goes from that kind of a setting into the real world, if you don't end up at a station you like, is going to be told,
well, even if you're at a station that you like. I mean, I was a part-timer at a station I like very much in Western Mass that still airs my radio show, but I was a part-time just regular DJ there as well. And I wasn't programming anything. It was music I liked, and the music director would sometimes put in stuff that he knew I liked, but I wasn't choosing what order it was going to be or anything like that. It was all voice tracked, so I would go in on Friday afternoon to record my Sunday shift.
Okay.
And none of it was sort of what I had in mind of what radio was. It was still fun, but it sure isn't what I would want to do as a job for the rest of my life.
Sure. Yeah. I haven't listened to your show, but I have heard some of your playlists, and you feature one of my favorite bands of all time. However, I think given the show you do, I don't listen to those albums.
Okay, so They Might Be Giants, clearly.
Absolutely it is. Yes. But I don't listen to the kids' albums as much.
Yeah.
I still have an argument with my father ongoing about which of us discovered They Might Be Giants first, because it would have been at the same period of time. Like, it would have been Flood.
Yeah.
My argument is that I discovered them on Tiny Toons.
Oh, sure.
And immediately jumped into stealing his CDs. But I don't know when he discovered it. And for anyone listening, who's following along with this, my favorite They Might Be Giants album of all time is John Henry. And I know they keep putting out albums, and it still remains my number one.
That's
as
great.
Close as Apollo 18 will get as my two.
Yeah, I mean, Apollo 18 is often in the mix for me. I love Flood, and I sort of unironically love the children's records, especially No. And the most recent one, Why, is also really, really great. The Here Come the are good albums. But yeah, I mean, and they do continue to put out remarkably good stuff. Book was a really, really good record. Yeah. But yeah, they were, so the radio show is called Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child. It's a kids radio show, or a family radio show. Music for kids and their grown-ups is what I like to say. And from the jump, we always start and end every show with They Might Be Giants. And when we started, this is, I think, our 18th or 19th year. My daughter, who's now doing her PhD, was like 5 when we started the radio show. And she wanted to start and end every show, not just with a They Might Be Giants song, but with Dr. Worm as the start and finish of, which, like, no shade, like, that's an entirely fair position. I said, we probably can't do that. That's probably not the approach we're going to take. And she's come around on that eventually. But
that was off of Severe Tire Damage.
Right. So the live album with one new song in it, which remains one of their greatest songs, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that is a sort of they have always been sort of representative of what I want to do with radio, which is to be sort of all over the place and be smart and weird and pretty varied. I mean, a They Might Be Giant song sounds like a They Might Be Giant song, but what that encompasses is pretty broad. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's, they're not an acquired taste necessarily, but I do think that your entry point into them will determine your taste for them.
I think that's right.
It's unlike some other bands. I think like there are a lot of, I've been falling back in love with the concept of the album as an art form, and I've been going back through and listening to old albums, and I think, as a lost art form, I know we're talking about radio, but part of music is finding those deep cuts. And it's being able to call out Dr. Worm from Severe Tire Damage, which, by the way, how many people can name a song in an album these days? I mean, we are in that kind of I'm not going to say I'm the most music lover of all music lovers, but I have to be in some percentile because there's a lot of people out there who will name a single and that's it.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think a lot of, artists understandably are focusing more on singles because that's really all that matters, right? Because it's you want to be the music bed for a TikTok, you want to be in the background of a YouTube video or whatever. It is not a lot. There's some album listening for sure. Like my son's in college, my daughter's in grad school. They both listen to albums. They're both weird in that respect, I think, but they're not completely on their own in their demographics in doing so. And so I don't want to become too much of the cranky old guys talking about how the kids these days.
Do you share music with them back and forth?
Very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I have that relationship with my father where I'm the one who told him you need to listen to Hackney Diamonds because the Rolling Stones have found what used to make them great, right? And
it's a weirdly good album. I haven't listened to it a ton, but it was unexpectedly good.
But I get to share books with him too. But music is kind of one of those things that we've always shared in my family, and I think that is from an early age fighting over They Might Be Giants albums and many other things. Like I know, at one point, shortly after my father retired, he was going through his CD collection and he was digitizing it into he had a Bose stereo that had internal storage. Yep. So he could move stuff in, and I would get calls. Hey, I seem to be missing Flashpoint, the one Rolling Stones live album. Do you have that one? And I would be like, maybe. So there's a lot of back and forth stealing that happens between, or used to happen before the streaming era, and I think it was good for our relationship. Is what I'll say.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was my dad he passed away 15 years ago now, but he was not a big music guy. He grew up in South Arkansas. He listened to some Clear Channel, not Clear Channel, the radio company, but Clear Channel AM signals, the very strong signals coming over the border from New Orleans. So he grew up listening to some jazz, and he had the Time Life box sets of jazz. He listened to some of that. But that was not a big part, and music was a big part of our lives, but mostly just the NPR classical station, and we were sort of encouraged to play instruments, but not anything from rock. Rock came into our lives relatively late. But
I guess a delineation here. Music is one thing, but was radio important? Because and when I say that, I'm thinking specifically of even in the mid to late 90s, sitting down with my folks and listening to a Prairie Home Companion.
Yeah, so that was actually the example I was going to give. Okay. So I remember listening to that, and the NPR station coming out of Tulsa when we lived in Oklahoma, and then coming out of the Twin Cities when we moved up here, was on quite regularly.
Okay.
So we heard a lot of classical, and that was, well, it sounds like kind of what your station is. It was a combination music and news information station. In the Twin Cities now, those have split into actually three. There's a news and information station, a classical station, and The Current, which is the equivalent of your afternoon show, the non-commercial AAA station. But yeah, a lot of that. And then, some of listening to KWN, which was that AM station I mentioned. But there's much more sharing of music with my kids, which is, I guess, is almost inevitable, right? In that they grew up literally on the radio with me. They were co-hosts when they were little. They like the show I recorded today. My son is home from college, so he was on. So they're still on the radio now, and he does a college radio station or a college radio show on the same station I did a college radio show on, which is kind of wild. So yeah, it's much more album and song sharing and radio sharing to some extent than I had with my parents. And that's not a criticism of them. It's just sort of a different relationship.
Yeah. I think that there has to be a generation out there who think that more than NPR, that Garrison Keillor and the way he delivered stories is the way you talk on radio. Because I mean, if
it's me, I've got to get closer and go, just start breathing really heavily.
Gotta hear you breathing.
Right?
Because that's still the mental audio I hear when I think about it, despite the fact that, like, when we talk about news and information, like, I remember being in the car with my father listening to Fresh Air.
Mm-hmm.
And so I very much grew up with NPR, but A Prairie Home Companion is the mental audio of NPR for me, despite everything else and what I know
really
to be true.
Because there's nothing else that sounds like that, right?
Yeah.
I actually just saw that he is doing a small tour of Prairie Home Companion shows again, very carefully not mentioning Minnesota Public Radio since they fired him. Talking about this is sort of a random aside, but I think that's part of what this is all about.
Yeah.
Talking about the Stern show having the single camera when it was on TV. Prairie Home Companion, I'm pretty sure, was the first radio show to do a live webcast, and it was a single camera that would update like every 5 seconds, just from the balcony. But I thought that, like, for being a show that was emphatically not about technology.
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting thing for them, or for Minnesota Public Radio, more likely to say, "Oh, we need to figure out what this web thing is going to be."
Yeah, and I wrote an article about this for my blog, and I was amazed to have found at the time a YouTube feed of it. But I remember watching Aerosmith live from Homedale, New Jersey, streamed through their website in about 97 or 98.
Oh, wow.
Which,
interesting.
At the time, I remember sitting in my bedroom with my dial-up internet and one of my best friends who was also into the band watching this, what had to be a postage-sized video of the concert.
Yeah, I'm sure it's terrible, yeah.
The sound was decent, I'll be honest, for that time period, but it's just, I think there's a part of me that will always be willing to forgive bad video for good audio.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's been one of the things that was an interesting thing to see in the early era of the pandemic, as bands tried to figure out how to replace some of the income from shows. And so, lots and lots of live streams where it was just like somebody sitting in front of a Shure 57 microphone and their iPhone or whatever. But then there were some very elaborate and very nice setups that I'm curious about whether. I mean, I know some venues are still using them, but like First Avenue here in Minneapolis spent a lot of money investing in a really nice live streaming setup that I don't think they're using anymore because they're back to just full on shows. But it was an interesting thing to see how quickly people evolved to figure out how to do really good quality live streams with nobody in the room.
Yeah, and the only thing that really took it away from me was not having an audience. It's very weird to not for that particular kind of a thing. Like if I'm listening to the Tiny Desk concert series or whatever it is, I know there's no audience, or there's like 3 other people in the room and they're all engineers. I'm not expecting like applause at the end of a thing, but yet like when somebody advertises that this is a live concert, even live to the internet, like I don't know, I expect a crowd.
So there was one model that I thought was interesting. So one of my favorite sort of current bands is the Hold Steady. I see them a ton, and they do every year in Brooklyn, the weekend after Thanksgiving weekend, they do a 4-night run at the Brooklyn Bowl. So nice venue there. And in the fall of 2020, what they did was they did a live stream 3 nights, I think. Multi-camera shoot, nobody there. So it's all pretty weird. But the thing that they did that was interesting was they had in addition to the stream you could stream, they had a Zoom call without, I don't know, hundreds of people, just fans on from home. So I watched it. I've got a TV down here to my right where I'm sitting here, nice stereo system. And I was down here with my daughter because she was home from college because they were all remote. And we had the Zoom going on my iPad next to it. And they had that Zoom up on the monitors in the room so the band could see. And they would just be switching from person to person. Everybody would wave or hold up signs or hold up their dogs or hold up their babies or whatever. And there was also a chat going on. Did not replace being in the audience. Like Frank Turner has a line like he was missing the times when we can close up the gaps between us. Like that being in a room with an audience is really important to me for seeing live music. And the pandemic continues to be tough on that front for me because I get very anxious about it. I still go to a lot of shows, but it gets me anxious, but that's a separate conversation. But that stretch where nobody was doing anything really was painful, but that was as close to a replacement for that. And I was deeply skeptical of it when they announced it. Like, what? I don't want to be on a Zoom call with people during I'm on Zoom calls all day at work.
Yeah.
But it was actually pretty great to see people literally all over the world watching this, experiencing at the same time, to go back to the way we started this conversation, to have knowing that all these people were experiencing this music at the same time was pretty special. And to know that the band was seeing us as well was kind of cool.
Yeah, I think I want to ask, what do you do then? Because like I'm currently just a free agent when it comes to marketing. I had a job and it ended right before the pandemic, and I've never really gotten full-time employment since then. It's kind of just been gig to gig to gig, and being behind the microphone has always been a passion for me.
Yeah,
but it's remained a passion, and I think it's very nice to have that delineation. And I think that Spare the Rock is your passion,
yes.
but it doesn't pay the bills.
No, it costs me money overall.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I could sell sponsorships for the show. If anybody's listening and wants to buy a sponsorship, be happy to talk to you about it. I'm a lawyer. I'm an in-house lawyer for a manufacturing company here in Minnesota. That is what I do.
Okay.
For a job. I also, so before we started talking for the actual show, I was telling you, I wasn't even sure which thing we were coming on to talk about, because I also am an adjunct law professor. I was a full-time law professor for 8 years. That's when I actually started the radio show. And I teach as an adjunct. Created a class that I teach that's about amusement park litigation and regulation and accidents and things around that. I have a casebook from that coming out. That is, again, not the thing that pays the bills. The thing that pays the bills is I'm a lawyer for a big company.
I only find it interesting, and I'm going to say this. I don't remember what episode it was, but I had a buddy of mine on, Rob. Who the heck knows? At a certain point, all these episodes run together. I'm going to say sometime in the 70s or 80s, but whatever. And Rob was telling the story about how he went to law school. It's where he met his wife. And he got out of law school, and he was a lawyer for about 1.5 years or 2 years. And he hated it. And he called up his old professor. And his old professor, when he learned he was unhappy, said, "How long have you been doing what you've been doing?" I don't know, 2.5 years. And he goes, "Yep, that's about the time. You either remain in it or don't." And so every time since then, on this show and in my private life, whenever I run into somebody who's still a lawyer, who's still doing law, I always have to ask, like, did you have that will I stay with it, won't I moment? Because it seems like, I mean, for the people I've talked to off the air, everybody's had that moment. It's just some people like Rob actually leave and then go into teaching or whatever else they're doing. And some people like yourself stay in it.
Yeah. So I have always, for the most part, liked what I do as a lawyer, but I have done a lot of different things is the other part. So I'll start with a thing that sounds like a joke, but is probably not. We moved around a fair amount when my kids were little, or actually until they were less little too. And whenever anybody asks my son why he moved around as much as he did, because he was born in Virginia, DC area, and then lived in Western Massachusetts, then lived in Austin, and now lives in the Twin Cities. He says, "Oh, my dad has untreated ADHD," and like he means it as a joke, but kind of not, right? I mean, and like they have it, and I probably do, and I've never bothered to get diagnosed. So I've changed paths a fair amount, all within sort of the world of law, right?
Okay.
So I started off, I clerked for a judge. That was always going to be a 2-year job, but it was a 2-year job as a lawyer. And then I practiced law with a big firm in DC for 4 years. Then I became a full-time law professor for 8 years. Then I went to another law firm. I was there for 7 years, did a pretty wide variety of stuff there. And now I went in-house to the job I have about 4 years ago. So the longest I've had a law-related job was 8 years. And even that one, when I was a law professor, 3 of those years I was associate dean. So it's been a lot of sort of...
You've shifted without
4 years
actually
at a time.
shifting.
Right, without changing it,
Yeah.
leaving it entirely. It's a lot of different angles on the same thing.
How long have you had the Spare the Rock?
18 or 19 years.
So that's
the thing I've done long. Other than being married, that is the thing I've done longest in my life.
Okay. I mean, and that can't be a coincidence. I mean, music has to be. I mean, you said it. You know, it's been around since you won those records. So it feels like was there ever a hey, I should get into music law? Was that
No? People asked me that when I was interviewing at firms. People sometimes they would kind of. This is before I had the radio show. I was just obsessed with music. They'd kind of be nudging me like, oh, this person represents a bunch of record labels or whatever. It's like that's not what interests me about music.
Okay.
And so I have this is going to sound more negative about my career than I intend it to, but I think of it as a means to an end. Like, I like what I do, and that's why I say it sounds more negative than I intend. I really genuinely do. I'm a litigator. I like being a litigator. I like the writing aspects of it. I now get to lead a lot of teams. I like that aspect of it. I think I'm pretty good at it. And I have fun with it, but it would not be a thing I would do if it wasn't also what made it so I get to do the radio show, and I get to go to see a lot of live music, and I get to support a lot of music, and I get to do all of those other things that are more important for sort of my soul, if you will.
God, yeah,
Does that
no,
make
I mean
sense?
I think that there are not you are working to live instead of living to work, and I think that's an important delineation, because I'm surrounded by people. And I think a lot of us that are living to work, which is not what we want. I don't even want that for people I don't know, much less my friends, where I'm like, just put it, close the laptop, just close it, just don't, it's not enough to put the movie on in the background. Like, just watch the movie.
Actually watch the movie. Yeah.
Is there, this is a hard shift, but I really want to ask this. Talking to a microphone is not something that comes naturally to everybody. And I think there's a lot of people who definitely can't talk to a microphone by themselves. Mm-hmm. Were you comfortable the moment you got, I guess 2 questions. 1, were you comfortable the moment you got in front of a microphone? And 2, were you comfortable the first time you were in a microphone talking to no one in particular?
Yeah. So I've always been reasonably comfortable speaking in front of people. I'm outgoing. I'm an extrovert. I get a lot of energy from that. I like that stuff. The talking to nobody in particular, being on radio. So I did college radio. I was at McAllister College in St. Paul, small liberal arts college, just down the street from where I live now. And I was comfortable, but not very good at it. I actually, behind me down there, I've got a bunch of tapes from when I was on. I occasionally go back, like, ooh, it's a little rough. I had listened to a ton of radio, so I knew what I liked. We had a pretty good commercial alt rock station here called KJJO, KJ104. It was one of the early alternative rock stations. The program director there went on to WRXY in Chicago, in Ohio, and now is at KXP in Seattle. And just great role model, great radio people on there in general. So I knew a lot of what I liked. And so I started off doing a lot of copying, which is not a bad way to start.
I mean, I think that's the way everybody should start.
Yeah. And then I didn't do radio again until when I started the show. And I started the show on a little community low power FM station in Western Massachusetts. And then about it, I don't remember, never remember, it's a year and a half or 2.5, little ways in, the commercial station, 93.9 The River, WRSI in Northampton, this is all in Western Massachusetts, said, hey, would you like to come over and do the show here for a little bit of money? And I mean a little bit of money. I was like $10 an hour, and then there was a pay cut so it's $9.50 an hour. But I said, sure, that sounds fun. Much better signal and much better equipment. And the program director there for many years, a guy named Monty Belmonte. He, and if you ever listened to the Judge John Hodgman podcast, Monty is the summer bailiff for that show. And he now is he moved maybe a year ago to the NPR station in Western Mass. So he's now he was doing mornings for, I don't know, 15 years, waking up at 3 a.m, moved over. But he was the program director, and I would do air checks with him. And I didn't ever do all that many, but he was just so good at saying, here's how you need to think about it. And, when you're doing a break, I know you have 5 things you want to talk about. You're going to have chances to talk about all of them eventually. Talk about one of them. And then the next time we play that artist, you can talk about the second one. And the next time you can play the third one. And just like the little tools that he gave me were great. And to think about, to figure out sort of who I was. And, doing it for 18 years, you either get good at it or you don't. But I think I've gotten pretty good at it. And to the extent I'm not, at least it sounds like me. Yeah. And doing it with my kids was really fun and also an adventure, right? Because if you've got a 6-year-old on or a 7-year-old, you have no idea what the hell they're going to say. And so that got me a lot better on my toes in terms of sort of adjusting the conversation and shifting it.
Yeah, I've never done improv. I've been around people that do improv. And I feel like in this setting, me and you, I've found my voice.
Sure.
Obviously I do my opens and closes technically in the dark by myself, right? I'm not, so I've gotten used to talking to no one. But there was a while where I was recruited by the executive director, one of the former executive directors for my local NPR, to do a show. Because he knew I was in podcasting. So he was like, you could talk on a mic. Like, it's not that, it's very hard to get people that are comfortable, that don't clam up or just the moment the red button's on, and you do this. And there's something about live. This is edited. I don't make any bones about it, but it's live to tape, and, the less editing, the better, the more natural it sounds, et cetera, et cetera. There's something about having that net that makes me fine. And
so have you done other than
no, not since college. Yeah, I
you
haven't
should give it
done
a shot, man. It's like I mean, I pre-record now, but I went back and I've done occasional live shows. It's really fun. I mean, it is scary, but it's fun.
Yeah, I think the one thing that makes me think about doing it more often than not, like the one pro that outweighs most of the cons, is the potential for actual feedback. We have all these outlets, regardless of what radio station uses, whether it be a social platform or a website or whatever, but you have this influx that, as an on-demand guy, I get that. I'll get that later. I don't get that now. I don't get somebody saying, "Of course, that's me too," and me going like, "Thanks, John in Salt Lake City. That this next song goes out." I don't have that, and so I think I think it's the only pro for me right now. But I'm too much of a perfect. I need to come up with a show concept. I don't think I can be thrown right in and just pick up and go. But it's definitely something I've got in the back of my head. And I think the more I spend time around the board of directors, I think it's probably inevitable I'll end up on there at some point. I just don't I don't know how many excuses I can have.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I did want to ask, though, when you're putting together your playlists, how much of it is, and I guess I'm going to ask for a percentage because I know nothing's exactly black and white, but like,
yep.
How much of it is how much you feel in the moment you're making it, and how much is it I've come up with a theme that I want to hit?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I usually start off, so the show is, it times out to an hour. It's actually about 54 minutes because people drop in promos and so on and so forth.
Yep.
In 3 segments. And I have sort of a general trajectory of the show each week. The middle segment is the one that I play a little bit harder rock stuff. That's called the Are You Prepared to Rock set. And then the other stuff sort of varies. First segment tends to be a little bit quieter. Third segment tends to be a little bit more varied. I start off, I try to have, maybe a third of the songs that I play be relatively new. I get a lot of new music in every week, and I try to feature some of that. And that tends to be sort of the seed around which themes can be developed. Okay. But not always. Sometimes, like, I think themes can be fun. They can be a little bit goofy. Like the show I did for this weekend when we're recording this, I picked one song that happened to be about zebras. I was like, I can come up with some other zebra songs. So I came up with some other zebra songs. I've got a pretty big collection at this point. I also, in one of the things that is unusual about this show for being a show that is sort of formally for kids, is that I probably a quarter of the stuff I play is not actually music that was made for kids. So I play a lot of They Might Be Giants that isn't from their kids' albums, for one thing. But there's a bunch of other stuff as well. And so I will often, I think of it as sort of the classical station in Austin had as part of their mission statement that they were going to be gently educational, which I kind of think of as being a good mission statement, because I don't want to be over the top. I'm not you should listen to this or hear, like, not very heavy handed. But if I'm playing like a kid's hip hop song from Secret Agent 23 Skidoo, maybe I'll find a Run DMC song to play next to it, that sort of thing. Because I want to, I used to have a promo that talked about the goal as being sort of creating the next generation of radio nerds. And I think that's going back to our very first conversation. One of the things that radio can do really well is show those connections between artists and between and among eras of music. So I kind of build it out from that as well. So it tends to be little seeds that I say, I think that song sounds a little bit like a Bee Gees song or whatever, and sort of build it out from there. So there's not a very clean answer to your question. And then sometimes there is certainly stuff where something in my life will say, I'm going to do that. Like I've had, like when my dad died, I was doing the radio show, and I did some stuff about grief. And I had my best friend from high school and college passed away from ALS, probably 6 years ago now. And I talked about friendship, and I talked about how sort of losing friends and stuff like that, which is a little bit heavy to do on a children's radio show. And I did it with sort of a light touch, but some of that stuff will come in. Or like last week, my daughter and her girlfriend and I and my wife went and saw Laura Jane Grace play. And the opener for that show was somebody I really liked, Mia, now I forget her last name. And so I'm playing something from her on this weekend show and talking about that show. And so sometimes it's just, I just heard this new band and here's a song that's kid appropriate and I really like it.
As you may have guessed, my interest in radio is for many reasons, but it was for me, as it was for Bill and many of you listening, our first introduction to the audio space for both music and talk. And it endures today for reasons we spoke about at the beginning, and probably for many more varied reasons that are so numerous as the many types of radio that there are that exist. Audio has always been about connecting. It connects us to what we are listening to and to those who are listening with us, whether they are listening around the country, around the block, or around the couch. Bill's show, Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child, seeks to engage a younger audience on their own, though his show is not limited to a younger audience. to foster their love of music and radio with more than just, I listen to what my parents listen to. And there's nothing wrong with that either. Music, and by extension radio and audio, is a medium unlike others because it can be shared and engaged with at any age. Sound is sound. If you can hear it, then it can entrance and entertain you even if the meaning isn't there. A good rhythm is more universal than a good rhyme. So tune in and turn on. Enjoy the radio and audio once more. You're already listening to me, aren't you? Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 116. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can find all related ways to contact my guest, Bill Childs, and myself in the show notes. There you can find more information about Bill and his show, Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child, at sparetherock.com. The music for this episode was provided by Henno Heitur. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. All right, Bill, do you have one final question for me?
I have what's probably going to turn into more than one final question for you.
Okay.
But I'm going to, the first question is, can you give me the ID as you gave it when you were doing college radio? When you were identifying your show and your station and yourself, how would you do it? And I'll do my college one.
No, you know what? The worst part about it is I can't remember the fourth call letter. Because I think
God invented Google for a reason. Is this Lehigh's college?
No. This was I went to Keystone College, the very small station, and I know they've changed their call letters since, which is horrible. I want to say you're listening to WKCX.
WKCV is what it is now.
Okay, I think it was KCX at the time, but if it was that, it was this is a funny story. And this is the saddest part of the whole thing. I don't remember what I called myself. And I remember this being a problem because when I joined the radio club, I had a nickname on campus. And my nickname wasn't necessarily radio friendly. It wasn't a bad word, but people called me Jesus. And I was told as a nickname that I did not give myself, I could not.
You couldn't be.
I couldn't be. You're listening to Jesus on WKCV, right?
There's the hip hop artist MC 900 Foot Jesus. You could have been that.
I don't think it was that. I believe I stole from, at the time, one of my favorite, and a lot of people when they can't come up with anything like myself steal. So I believe I went with Master Shake. I believe you were listening to Master Shake from Aqua Teen Hunger Force. I didn't change a thing. It was, it went out to the campus. I think if it hit Factoryville down the road, I would be surprised. So it was literally just, you're listening to WKCV. Agent Palmer plays you what he feels like. And that was my show. What did you
feel like mostly? What did you play?
So at the time, it was... a bunch of They Might Be Giants stuff. Okay. But I also this was in a time where I was very much looking backward a lot. So I was listening to Floyd and Zeppelin a lot.
Sure.
I always had Guns and Metallica. And I was very much not where I am now, where now I'm very much I've been listening to a lot of Dylan lately. And I've gone even further and further back in the band.
Yeah.
At that time, if I played any song before 1976, I'd be shocked. Because it was very much like I remember one of the go-tos was, if I needed a break, was the Zeppelin Stairway from the just then released BBC Sessions double album.
Yeah.
And so it was a lot of that, a lot of Rush. So it was in that kind of vein, but at the same time, you were never going to hear the hits from me.
Sure.
You were like, I would play stuff from Appetite, but it was like, you would never hear Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, or like that. Those were not things I was going to play.
You're playing Mr. Brownstone maybe instead or something.
Maybe, but I mean, one of my favorite Gun songs to play at that time was the cover from the Spaghetti Incident of Since I Don't Have You, which
I don't even know that one. I Appetite for Destruction is kind of where my beginning and end of
the very
most of my
last Guns N' Roses album they ever released together before they just reformed and before Chinese of the original was called the Spaghetti Incident, and it was
I remember it came out.
It was nothing but covers, and they are great covers, by the way. But Since I Don't Have You doesn't belong, but it very much belongs. It's kind of like any time like a band like Bowling for Soup takes a song from like the 70s that's slow and sappy and goes, what if we put it on
make it a ska song or whatever.
Yeah. So it's kind of that thing. Yeah. So it was very much whatever. And here's the other thing. I was playing bass in a metal band. I never played anything we would play. I was in a 2-man band where I played guitar, and I never played anything we played there. So like there was some Skynyrd and some like Sex Pistols and stuff and Green Day, things that I could actually play and that you would hear me play on the little stage with the bands. You would never hear from my show.
So that's the thing that sort of clearly distinguishes the age here is that, so while I was in college, I took a year off and opened a record store and in Minneapolis. And the first time Green Day ever played acoustically in front of people was in that store.
Oh, nice.
This is back when Dookie was, Kerplunk had just come out. Yep. So they were still on the Lookout record. So way back in the day. So anyway.
Very nice.
Well, I unfortunately, I can't figure out what the call letters were before. I was poking around, and they've got the history, but it's WKCV LP, so it's a low power FM station now, which it would not have formerly been. I
believe it was WKCX at the time, because that's what's in my head. And I was, it was at the time, it wasn't on all the time. Like it was very much like a club, not like we're going to do this all the time.
Right.
I think I might have taken it a little bit more seriously, but we had off-air times like there for the time. It was great to have a show where you could say things like, while you're downloading that stuff on, and this was post Napster, but like during the Kazaa LimeWire era of pirating. Right. Where you could say things like, hey, if you really like this song, it's on They Might Be Giants, John Henry, and you can get that on LimeWire whenever you're ready. Like it was a very, I'm not proud of it, right? But like,
it's what it is.
It's what we said. It was the era of the time. And if there was an album or a thing or, whatever. And so, it was, that was my experience of just like, this is what I feel like.
And what did you like about doing radio? I realized it was only supposed to be one more question, but since you don't want to go back and do live radio now, I'm wondering what was the biggest thing you got out of doing that?
I think it was access. It was still a bunch of CDs, right? Yeah. And there were records and tapes and 8-tracks. Like this was very much this was pre-digital, but it was at the crossroads where CDs hadn't completely taken over, and you could play, something from Moving Pictures on the vinyl.
Yeah.
And so I think it was almost more personal. I think the audience was secondary to my experience sitting in that booth and having access to this massive collection of music that
Totally.
even with, I mean, I think it goes back to, you know, it's not curation, but there is something to be said for going to the library versus searching the internet.
Mm-hmm.
At a library, you can browse. On the internet, you have to search.
Yeah.
And if I just look at that shelf and go, that looks interesting, I can play that. Or like, oh, I haven't heard anything from Alice Cooper in a very long time. Let's play something from that. It's very different than just sitting down like we were doing in the dorms and being like, I don't know, name a album I can look for. It's like, there was something about it.
So I've visited my son when he does his radio show a couple times, which is again in the same studio, same station I was on 30 years ago. Yeah, 30 years ago. And they still have a massive vinyl collection and a big CD collection. A lot of the CDs are from when I was there, and they still have the notes on them from the music director when I was there.
Okay.
And those notes were like a way to find out, oh, well, if Dave Gardner, now an amazing mastering engineer in San Francisco, says this song is awesome, I should probably play this song on my show. And that's how I found out about Superchunk. I mean, anyway, so yeah, I'm with you. I agree.
Yeah.
Same
and I will also say, for not to be underrated as a place for music, but from about 1985 through about 1997, we would rent the most ridiculous movies. But a lot of them, even if they were crap, had great music.
Sure.
I don't know what it was about that era of filmmaker. Whether they could shoot a movie well or not, a lot of them had great taste in music. Yeah. And you would find bands by wading through the credits of a crappy movie that you would just never have discovered in any other way.
Yeah.
And so that was a way, again, to kind of fuel, maybe not the radio station so much, because some of those were not available, but to, you know,
expand your
songs to
horizon,
learn, songs to play, etc. And so, I don't know. I guess the other answer, which is the truth, and maybe more to the truth than anything else, I've always been music adjacent.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm playing in bands, sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm listening to music, and sometimes I'm playing it for others. But I've never been too far away from it.
For sure.
So, yeah.
Cool.